I want to start this video by saying that I absolutely adore the Sega Genesis. It's easily one of my favorite consoles of all time. So I gave myself a challenge on my Twitch stream and with my Twitch chat. I dared us to find 10 of the worst games that we possibly could on the system. And I think I've come up with a pretty good list here. And we made things even harder by not allowing movie licensed games of any sort. So I managed to find, with the help of my stream, 10 games that I genuinely think are awful and I want to make sure you guys are steered clear from. So without any further ado, let's jump right in. And I also want to briefly mention before we get going here that these games are not in any particular ranked order. These are just 10 of the worst games that I could find, and they honestly are pretty comparable in terms of how awful. So we're just going to go in alphabetical order, which means we get to start with our pal Awesome Possum in the A's here. And if you guys aren't aware, the full title is Awesome Possum ellipses kicks Dr. Machino's butt. That sounds cool, doesn't it? Well, I'm here to tell you it's very much not. This game is pretty notorious. I think it's been covered by others. All I want to say is that this was an educational game in some weird regard. Essentially, the devs wanted to teach children about the dangers of polluting the environment and teach them about recycling and respecting the world that we have. And honestly, simply, bluntly, it fails at doing that because I think most kids probably turned this garbage off before they even got to learn anything, because the way that this game tries to teach you is by shoehorning these little quiz questions in between different levels. Once you finish a level, you take this little quiz question that has to do with the environment, and the questions are pretty basic, they're pretty dumb, they're pretty easy, you're not going to learn a whole lot. Like I said, probably most kids didn't get there because the gameplay is so bad. This is one of the worst 2D platformers I have personally played, not only on the Genesis, but just in general. It is shockingly terrible, and I'm not just saying that because it doesn't look great, right? The visuals are rough. Its color palette is not very good. Sprites feel very basic, even for Genesis standards. Parallax scrolling in the background, there is a little bit of parallax. They did try there, but it is some of the cheapest parallax scrolling I've seen in a Genesis game in a long time. The kicker for all of this is the fact that it looks so bad, but also the frame rate on top of it is terrible. This is clearly not pushing the Genesis hardware. Why does this run so poorly? And it makes the game incredibly hard to play when the frame rate is jumping all over the place. A lot of times it's single digits. I think this game would be hard regardless, but the technical side is such a mess that this is one of the toughest platformers to play on the systems. I think it fails in what it tries to do. I can't recommend anyone try this. Next up in the B's, we got a game called Beast Wrestler, which I have to admit sounded cool to me. I thought the title alone was gonna make this a banger. While it isn't the worst thing I've ever played, the cardinal sin of this one is just the fact that it's so brain dead simple. It is disappointingly simple to play. There is very little in terms of controls. You have a punch button, you have a tail whip button, and you have a special button, and that is literally it. And it turns out the punches are pretty much useless. The tail whips can be effective, but really the only way to take out these enemies is by using your specials and knocking them down. And it does play like a wrestling game. Once you knock them down 3 times, that is it. You win the match and you move on. There are some other cool elements to this game. They tried some things. There actually is like a genetic recombination system with these beasts, and you can actually upgrade your beast. Unfortunately, that is once again another aspect where I was really let down by this game and had to put it on this list, because once I upgraded my beast, right, you'd think, oh, he's more powerful, could do better damage, better attacks, maybe a better special. Not only was the tail whip rendered ineffective because the hitbox was broken, the special was also worse, that I couldn't hit with that either. So I literally made the game unplayable. A shocking revelation, because at worst before that it was borderline passable. I mean, still very basic. Like, it would have been fun for a weekend rental, but literally the game like broke itself when I tried to upgrade my beast. So for that reason alone, gotta put this on the list. It also has, for those that like janky translations, it has one of the dumbest translations I've ever seen with tons of mistakes. So if you like that, that might be a reason to check this one out. Now, this next one I feel a little bit bad putting on here, but unfortunately the gameplay was so rough that I do consider it one of the worst Genesis games I played, and that is a game called Cybercop. Now, I do want to preface by saying that this game actually released on a series of computers, including the Atari ST and MS-DOS, and was called Corporation, and is a very, very early example of a 3D first-person shooter. This predates Wolfenstein 3D even. But unfortunately, as it stands, the Genesis version is one of the worst games I've played, and it simply comes down to the fact that the Genesis was just not ready for this kind of 3D. It is one of Core Design's earliest games, so it's interesting to see them trying something so ambitious, but it just falls so flat. The polygons are all untextured, and it makes level design and trying to traverse these levels near impossible. There's no sense of direction. Now, the shooting is fine, but if you're not sure where to go and you're just aimlessly wandering around at like 5 frames a second, it's really hard to recommend this game to just about anyone. And I'm somebody that loves the history of video games. I can only take so much. This was a really tough one. I'd avoid this. Many of you are probably expecting this next one on the list, and after having played it myself, I have to agree, this deserves to be on here, and that is the Genesis port of Dark Castle, released in 1991 by EA. If you guys aren't aware, Dark Castle actually initially released back in 1986 on the Mac, and then got ported to a whole bunch of other computers in 1987 and 88. At the time, the game was actually pretty well revered for being kind of an innovator in the adventure genre on PCs. Let's just face it, the reality of this release is that it's 5 years later in a period of immense technological growth and gameplay development. I think this game just does not hold up. It does not hold a candle to the other action adventure games on the Genesis at the time that it was competing with. It's just too little too late, and it's clearly a game that is probably best played on mouse and keyboard, because trying to play this on a Genesis pad is so incredibly awkward and frustrating. You do have projectiles you can throw, but you almost have to like aim it like a cannon. You have to like hold up or down to be able to aim. It's just all very slow, not responsive. You trip over everything, even like the tiniest little elevation drop, you're just gonna trip over. I tried grabbing a mace in this game on one of the screens, and I probably spent a good 5 whole minutes just trying to grab the mace, which you're supposed to be able to grab. I tried all bunches of different positions, putting my arm up, down, left, right, sideways, everything you could possibly imagine. Couldn't do it. The basic functions of this game are incredibly hard to do. Not to mention the graphics are very underwhelming for 1991. Sound design is pretty piss poor, and just all around this is a pretty pathetic port of a once pretty solid adventure game on the PCs. Representing the letter H, next we've got Heavy Nova. Now, this is a game that honestly, if I were looking at magazines back in the day, I probably would have bought this game. The title was cool, and the screenshots, when you're not seeing the game in motion, actually looks all right. But once you get to actually playing it, you'll notice a severe host of problems playing this. Essentially, this is a combination side-scrolling beat 'em up and fighting game, which sounds great, right? On paper, combining those genres, like no-brainer, but this does it incredibly poorly. And the first thing you'll notice in the first level is the main character is very poorly animated, very few frames, it's very choppy, and unfortunately that choppiness also translates to the controls. It just does not feel responsive in the slightest. It is very unsatisfying to play. But that being said, the beat 'em up sections are pretty simple. They only throw a couple enemies at you at a time. They're pretty easy to take out. Those are fine enough. But once you get to the fighting sections, that's where things really kick it up a notch, and not in a good way. The fighting sequences are, for the most part, pretty easy as long as you don't let the enemies stun lock you. And what do I mean by that? Well, there are situations playing this where you can easily get hit and knocked down by an enemy, and they will stun lock you. The moment that you get back up, they will hit you again. You will fall back down. You gotta wait to get back up just to inevitably get knocked again. And this will become an endless cycle, and you won't be able to get out of it. I tried everything in my power. It breaks this game. It would be a mediocre game at best without this game breaking glitch, but with it, it's unplayable. For the eyes here, we've got the incredible Crash Test Dummies. Now, I'm sure some are gonna be like, hey, you're putting a licensed game on here. I guess it is kind of a licensed game, but I specifically didn't want to include any movie games because I felt like that was just going to be too easy. This one I feel like is pretty obscure. There may have been a TV show for this franchise at the time, but this is actually, according to the Wikipedia page, based on the toy line. So I'm going to consider it for this list, and I do think it is genuinely bad. Now, you'll probably notice from the gameplay here that the visuals actually look quite good. This is probably the best looking game we've had on this list so far, but that is pretty much where the positives end. The only other thing I will say is that I do actually like like the concept of using these test dummies as your main character, and the idea of getting hit and losing your limbs is kind of a novel concept, and it's a shame that it's butchered by this otherwise really unfun, unfair game. Really, it just comes down to the fact that this game moves too quickly. Like, it runs too well, right? It's almost the opposite issue of Awesome Possum. The frame rate is so rock solid. It's just stuff moves at you too quickly. You can't react. There's no reaction time. Additionally, this is one of those games where it moves almost so fast that I was starting to get motion sick playing it, which for me is a big no-no because I almost never have that happen. It is so rare that I play a game and it makes me actively nauseous. And this is unfortunately one of those games. So for that reason alone, I got to put it on here. And in addition, just the horrid level design. It's just nothing makes any sense. And that is one of my biggest pet peeves in 2D platforming. Just when the devs get to just throw shit all over the place in no meaningful way. And it's like they're just trying to fill out these levels that would otherwise be very bland and uninspired. Incredible crash test, Dummies. Can't recommend. For the J's here, I'm going with James Pond Underwater Agent. And I want to say that I feel like I've been mostly objective in this list thus far, but I'm going to come clean. I'm putting this on here because I just got shit against James Pond. I think it is one of the dumbest characters to come out of the early 90s. It's literally just born out of the pun. Like, hey, we'll take James Bond, change the B to a P, now it's James Pond. Get it? He's a fish? Who thought that was a good idea? Why does this character exist? Why does he have sequels? I went ahead and chose the first one because I do think it is the worst of the games that were released. Obviously, as the series went on, they did get a little bit better, but at best, I find these mediocre action-adventure kind of 2D side-scrolling games, and at worst, I find them severely lacking in inspiration and just not fun. I don't understand the thrill of these games, never have, never will. I'm biased on this one, I'll admit it, but I just despise this franchise, to be truly honest. Next up, we got a couple fighting games for you, the fighting game fans here. There are some rough ones on the Genesis, and we're gonna start with a game called Slaughter Sport. Now, this came out on the Genesis in 1991. If you guys are unfamiliar with this game, I'm sure many of you are. There is actually an earlier PC version from '89 called Tongue of the Fatman. I don't know why they changed the title. Honestly, I think the game probably would have done a little bit better had they rebranded it with that old title. I think the weirdness factor would have helped it out. As it stands, I mean, Slaughter Sport's a fine name. The cover art's decent, but not very gripping. And unfortunately, that translates to the gameplay as well. This is a very abysmal fighting game. Now, I know originally '89, fighting games weren't as prevalent then, right? This is pre-Street Fighter 2, so we kind of had to just grasp for straws to get what we got. The main sin of this one is the fact that just the timing between pressing a button to attack and then having that attack animation play out and then hitting your opponent, which hopefully you manage to hit them. There's such a gap there that it just makes this really insufferable to play, which is unfortunate because there are some cool ideas. First of all, Mondu is the fat man we're speaking of. He's got this giant stomach with a tongue that comes out. Such a unique character design. And unfortunately, they botch it by only having you play as like this dude named Rex, who is like super basic. Now, you can play as the other characters, but you essentially have to play through the game to get cheat codes to play as the other characters. Very strange approach to character selecting. And the other thing I will give this game credit for is the shop system. You gain money each time you win a fight, and you can use that money to not only upgrade your stats in terms of your health and your power, and you can also buy special items, including bees and an item that doesn't let your opponent jump. Like, there's some neat ideas in there. Honestly, the bees seem like the best way to do it. That's the other thing. The main attacks in this game feel basically useless when you compare them to the specials. I mean, I know special items are supposed to do more damage, but I mean, it's night and day. Like, the bees were basically the only way I was getting anywhere in this game. Just a flawed fighting game, and not one that I recommend for many unless you just want to sample it out quickly to see what early fighting games were like. And the other fighting game I've got to talk about today is Time Killers. Now, this one is not egregious from a mechanical standpoint. It's fine for what it is. There are certainly other fighting games, even on the Genesis, that I would much rather play over this, but it's serviceable in that department. I'm mainly putting this on the list because this game came out all the way in 1996. This is an extremely late example of a Genesis game. For it to look and sound as bad as it does is honestly an insult to this console, I think. It has some of the worst color palettes, some of the worst sprite designs, some of the worst backgrounds. This is just all around an absolutely ugly looking game from an aesthetic and sound standpoint. It is shockingly terrible. Honestly, the devs should be ashamed that they released something that looked and sounded this bad on a system as capable as the Genesis as late as 1996. And to round off this list today, I am ending with a game called X-Perts. Yes, X-Perts. Apparently, this is actually a spin-off of the Eternal Champions game on Genesis. Actually, a decent little fighting game on the Genesis. This takes it and tries to make some sort of action-adventure game with these characters. It is abysmally terrible. Essentially, you start in this underground layer with all these different levels. You're trying to get through and unlock doors, rescue companions. There is character swapping in this game, which kind of makes it somewhat unique, but essentially you're walking through what look like these same endless, bland, semi-futuristic corridors with not a whole lot going on. The random enemy pops up occasionally. The combat is very pedestrian and basic. I mean, it's serviceable, but nothing to it. It feels like purgatory, honestly, is the best way I could describe it. It just doesn't seem to go anywhere. Even when you're getting things done, you don't feel like you're accomplishing anything, which I think is a horrible feeling in any video game, right? If you're doing something, you want to feel like things are happening, and this game just lacks that. It lacks really any sort of pizzazz or any sort of charm, and is just abysmally unfun. So there you have it, guys. Those are 10 of the absolute worst Genesis games I have personally played. Now, I do have other lists prepared. I've been playing a lot of Genesis over on my Twitch streams in order to get footage and gameplay for these videos. So if you guys want to join in on the fun and maybe request some games, you absolutely can over there as we continue to delve into the Genesis library. And I do have more videos coming out. I do want to do some movie license games lists as well as comic books. There's a lot of ground to cover on the Genesis, over 800 games, and a lot of which are good. I don't want to just do bad. I kind of want to do both sides of the coin, both best and worst. And I've been just having a lot of fun exploring this library. So love to know what you guys think down below. What did I miss? What should I play? And until next time, guys, take care. And honestly, simply, bluntly, it fails at doing that because I think most kids honestly are garbage.